to week 3 of the NeMTSS Summit. In the 2 weeks prior, we have explored and been provided some great strategies within an MTSS framework focusing on equitable opportunities for all, as well as engaging in strengthening partnerships. We have had the opportunity to learn from some phenomenal national presenters, and today is certainly no different. I have the privilege of introducing Ruth Cross, Senior SEL Consultant and Trainer for the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, or abbreviated as CASEL. Ruth received her MA in Educational Administration and Leadership. She is responsible for supporting school districts to implement systemic, social, and emotional district and school-wide change, which includes consulting with large districts such as Chicago Public Schools, coaching smaller districts, as well as partnering with the Consortium for Educational Change, or CEC, to implement SEL in Central Illinois. She is also a consultant for CASEL Collaborative States Initiative. Her experience in working on state policy includes co-chairing the committee that wrote the SEL standards and serving as a member of the Illinois State Board of Education for 3 years. Prior to joining CASEL staff, Ruth co-chaired the CASEL IC Advisory Council, whose primary goal was to assist schools with the implementation of comprehensive, research-based social and emotional learning programs. She was also co-chair of the School Policy and Standards Committee. Prior to that, she worked for an impressive 34 years as a teacher, assistant principal, and assistant superintendent. As a building principal, she was instrumental in the implementation of programs that enable students to acquire skills to improve interpersonal relationships and prevent conflict. Ruth continues working to expand social and emotional learning in Illinois by presenting administrator academies and leading workshops on the importance of teaching social and emotional learning. So it is without further ado, I welcome Ruth Cross to engage us in learning about how to create a positive and safe school culture by focusing on building strong adult relationships.
Thank you, Casey. And so I am going to share my screen and my PowerPoint. And we're going to begin with a welcoming activity. I would like for each of you who are on this webinar to think of one way you have cared for yourself during this time of physical distancing and you're having to stay at home. Write in the chat box, if you would, how you have practiced self-care.
Ruth, I see some answers coming in. We're seeing golfing, making time to exercise, regular exercise, reading books for pleasure, not professional learning, talking with friends, learning a new skill, exercising, showing up again, beach time, healthy activities and eating well, walking my dog in the mornings, taking on gardening over the summer, enjoying the great outdoors, and people are mentioning sleep, getting plenty of needed sleep, a riding bike.
Yes. Thank you so much for reading those, and I'm very grateful for each of you who have responded. And we're now going to the next activity. Well, just a moment, as my screen does not seem to be moving. Here we are. So one of the things I would like for us to think about on this call, would you please go into your participants bar, click on it at the bottom of your screen, move the cursor over to the video icon next to your name, and click on more. And when that appears, you could rename, for instance, Jessica Bernstein would add CASEL behind her name. That will allow everyone who is part of this call to see who is participating. And just a reminder, be mindful of background noise and utilize the mute button when it is appropriate. So that's some virtual housekeeping that will help make this webinar go better, I hope. So why are we focusing on adult social and emotional learning? And I'm going to ask you to read this quote. This is by Stephanie Jones, and Stephanie Jones is a researcher at Harvard who's done a lot of work on the importance of adults building skills. I particularly love this photo of the bicycle jumping over everybody. It really indicates to me that we have to have these skills as adults in order to be able to teach them to students. So what does the research say about why adult SEL is important? There's some research done by Bart Brackett at the Yale Institute for Emotional Regulation, and he talks about adults who can recognize, understand, label, and express, regulate their own emotions. That's his approach, called the ruler approach. They're more likely to demonstrate patience and empathy, have healthy communication, and create safe learning environments. Teachers regulating their emotions also have less burnout and more positive affect while teaching. And this last bullet point, I think, is extremely important for all of us to pay attention to. The quality of student-teacher relationships is a better predictor of academic performance than teacher education, experience, or class size. So for me, that really captures the importance of developing our own competencies in order to promote those student-teacher relationships. So having these competencies not only benefits us, but it benefits schools. Teachers who possess the SEL competencies are more likely to stay in the classroom longer. We know that this is important because we have been in a state recently where it has been difficult to retain and to keep, well, first to gather good teachers into our classrooms, then to retain them because they burn out easily. And they're disappointed when they get into the classroom and things are not going the way that it went for them as a teacher. So building these competencies will allow them to have the skills that they need to deal with challenging students and challenging situations that often lead to burnout. So when Castle talks about strengthening the adult SEL competency and capacity, we focus on 3 areas. The first area is learning the competencies, being able to understand not only the core competencies of social and emotional learning, which I think most of you are familiar with, understanding oneself, which is self-awareness, understanding how to manage oneself, which is self-management, understanding the viewpoints of others and how your actions impact others, that's social awareness. And then along with social awareness goes relationship skills, building those skills that allow you to work collaboratively with other people, to identify problems together, to create solutions. And that moves us into the 5th core competencies, which is responsible decision making. So not only do we talk about how we learn and strengthen those skills, we also talk about how we develop our cultural competencies by using those skills. If you do not deeply understand the social emotional competencies, it's very difficult to teach them. It is equally difficult to collaborate and to create structures that foster trust and collaboration among your peers. And finally, when you have these competencies, you are more able to model them. That is an extremely important point because we all know as educators that students learn what they see more than they learn what we say. So those are the 3 areas that we focus on at Castle when we talk about strengthening your adult competencies. Moving along, why is it important to focus on adult SEL right now in this moment? Well, this is an unprecedented opportunity to recenter our collective well-being. And that's one of the reasons I started with the welcoming activity to ask you, how are you caring for yourself? because as adults, we must be able to care for ourselves before we can provide a healing space for students. It's very much like what you hear when you fly in a plane, when they talk to you about the oxygen mask dropping down and being sure that you place it on yourself before you help kids who are traveling with you. It is just the same with us in the adult competencies. We must have them to provide a healing space for students, to have structured opportunities to heal and connect ourselves to our peers as well as to our students and their families. This has been a traumatic time for young people and for adults. And the trauma is not the same for all of us. So it is incumbent upon us to help young people express and manage their emotions so they can make sense out of these experiences that they don't really often understand. So as we develop these competencies, we provide opportunities for educators to listen, to heal, to co-regulate with their colleagues. We're not in this alone. We have our colleagues to support us. Although all staff have been impacted by the pandemic and the current unrest, not all school staff have had the same experiences. This makes us think about the prevention of secondary trauma, compassion fatigue, and the promotion of staff wellness at systems level Tier 1 effort. It is very easy for the staff to engage in secondary trauma when they have students who have experienced severe trauma. They tend to take that on themselves. This leads to fatigue. As we know that we can all benefit from healing-centered SEL practices and those climates that are established, that are thoughtful and include mental health supports, relationship building, not only with each other, with our students, and with our families. When you lead SEL for equity, you prioritize relationships and you center whole person wellness. That is our charge for now, because all of us have experienced trauma of some sort. If it has not been the illness from COVID-19, we have families and that experience the economic and the racial unrest in our country. So we have to prioritize relationships, and we have to begin with centering whole person wellness. Moving along, what does it look like now? What does social and emotional learning for adults look like? We have to make a space for connecting, for listening and healing. I want you to think about that for a moment. A space for connecting with each other, for listening and healing. What would that space look like in your school? Think about that, reflect on that. And could you jot in the chat box what you think that space would look like? This is new for us because we haven't had to concentrate on a space for connecting with each other, for listening, for taking care of ourselves and our colleagues. I see we have a few in the chat.
Looks like inviting, calming, and collaborative.
Okay.
Could be during a PLC or department meeting space or designated office space. And then some are saying they don't have that.
And I think it's true. You're right. We don't have that. But that is something that when school begins, we have to consider. It is not unusual to have a calm down spot for kids. It is not unusual to have a room where kids can go and decompress. It is important in this moment in history that we all consider what that might look like for the adults that need to have a place to connect, to listen, to calm down, to decompress. So that's something I would suggest that you take back to your schools, thinking about that, deciding what it would look like. And it may just happen in a grade level meeting. You might start your meetings with a welcoming activity, beginning with, what do you need to do today to care for yourself? How have you been caring for yourself? How do you listen to each other? What are those important skills you must have to be an active listener? In addition to providing that space, we need professional learning in order to build the educator's capacity to support students' SEL, and I'm going to talk about that a little later. And then we have to ensure that mental health and trauma supports are in place for adults, just as they are in place for students. Moving along, let's talk about this bucket of learning. What does it look like when we're talking about learning? We need regular opportunities for the staff to reflect and learn their own social and emotional cultural competencies embedded in meetings and in their professional learning. We need structured activities to support our staff in practicing self-care and examining their own mindsets and biases. An SEL team action might be to regularly review data related to the adult SEL and cultural competencies in order to plan ongoing support, in order to really have a professional learning opportunity that meets the needs of all of your adults in your building. And you collect data to determine that, and you might collect data through a survey or your focus group, asking the adults, what do they need right now in order to support them as adults who are going to be building a supportive environment for all students. So those are some examples about what it would look like and what we would have to learn. I am going to suggest that this tool is something that you take back to your district. This is called a personal assessment and reflection tool. Each person is asked to take this tool seriously in order to determine where they are strong and where they need to grow. I will send this to the leaders of this conference to make sure that all of you have access to this tool. But you begin with looking at your self-awareness because it is important to know who we are as an adult. Are we emotionally self-aware? Are we able to identify and recognize our emotions? Do we have self-confidence? And on the side of the right, you will see that, yeah, I can do that rarely, sometimes, or I do that often. You are evaluating your own skills, and this tool is built for looking at self-awareness, self-management. It's also for social awareness, relationship skills, and decision-making. It is a very important tool to help you understand where you have strengths and where you need to grow. I would encourage each of you to take this assessment on your own. This is a personal assessment tool, not to be shared with others, not to be shared with people who supervise you. It is for your own growth and development. I have, however, seen school teams come together and discuss this personal assessment tool voluntarily in order to understand the strengths of their peers, in order to identify their own strengths, and in order to understand where each of you need to grow. But again, I want to emphasize that is voluntary, and it is important that everyone buy into sharing this personal assessment and reflection too. So that's how we learn about ourselves. When you engage in this reflection, you consider debriefing these questions. What was it like to engage? How would you use this tool to support adults in learning about and reflecting on SEL? And you can click on this link for additional resources. Moving along, what does it mean to collaborate as an adult? What will it look like? One of the first things that we encourage staff to do is to create shared agreements. Shared agreements guide respectful interactions, effective collaboration, and an inclusive staff culture. These agreements may look like be a learner, respect all ideas, use technology responsibly. Whatever your shared agreement is, it helps you move forward in your learning, in your professional learning opportunities, in your grade level meetings. So shared agreements is one way to collaborate. You all agree on them. You occasionally look at them and reevaluate them. Then we also suggest that you have dedicated time for the staff to learn together, to share best practices, and to collaboratively problem solve. If you're having an issue with a student and you bring it to your team and ask for their ideas on how you can deal with that student, you learn from each other. You also share your best practices. When I was a building administrator, one of the things that we did, we quit having informational staff meetings. By contract, I could have 9 staff meetings for an hour to an hour and a half a year. Those staff meetings became professional learning opportunities, and staff volunteered best practices that they wanted to share, not only in academics such as reading and math and social science and science, but we were implementing a social emotional learning evidence-based program. And they shared best practices that they had learned from implementing that program. That time was protected, not only by me as an administrator, but it was protected and it was valued by the staff because they were learning from each other. Another action that you can take is to plan structures that foster a sense of community and a shared purpose among the staff. That professional learning opportunity fostered a sense of community and shared purpose among the staff. And then we look at data, and we look at data on staff perceptions to improve our climate. In many states around the country, and particularly since ESSA has been a part of our new plan, we are encouraging districts and schools to do a climate survey, to look at the data around staff perceptions about the climate, to look at the data around student perceptions, and also to look at the data around family perceptions of the climate. When you understand what those staff perceptions are, you can then design some professional learning or some structures to make your climate more appropriate for every staff member. So fostering collaboration requires not only ongoing structured opportunities for educators to connect and heal and cultivate their own competencies and capacities, but it requires us to consider key ideas for the moment we're in. I talked to you about creating that space. When you return to your schools, to your districts, think about that. Think about what you need, when that would work best for everybody. It simply could be a professional learning day where you really concentrate on wellness for adults. You may have some exercise during that time. You might have an opportunity to talk about how you work with each other, how you collaborate in order to promote well-being, how you share what you've learned from each other. You should also tap into the sense of purpose and meaning that fuels our practice and our sense of wellness. Do all of us feel a sense of purpose about taking care of ourselves? One of the things that I have learned through the years is that as educators, we're really good about taking care of our children. We're not that good about taking care of ourselves. But I want to remind you that it's important for us to practice self-care, for it to have purpose and meaning to us so that we are able to practice self-care for others. So when you go back to your schools, I want you to think about what adults in your districts need most right now. And I want you to reflect on that here and now. What do you think the adults, you've been in school for about 3 weeks, what do you think adults in your districts need most right now? Reflect on that for a moment and drop it in the chat box.
I'm seeing time, grace, grace again, permission to do whatever is needed, encouragement, more work time with students, time to collaborate with teams, permission to take care of themselves and their families.
That permission is really important. And that means that your administrators at the district level and at your building level have to understand the importance of this and to develop some structures for allowing adults to have time to care for each other. I want you now to think back to the spring when all of a sudden we were doing virtual learning. Did you have any supports in your schools and your districts that really helped you as you moved to that virtual learning? And if you didn't, what would you wish to have that was missing? Think about that. And that seems like forever to me. It's been a long time since March, but it was a difficult time for all of us. So drop in the chat box what you would have liked to have had or what you did have that worked well.
I'm seeing more tech support. It was chaos. We needed to prepare for internet connections for all students and technical devices for students. Knowledge of technology, more tech support, regular communication.
And I think we all experienced that. And one of the things that we all learned very quickly is that we had students who did not have the tech equipment or the internet's facility and capacity that they needed in order to work virtually. We also learned that it was very hard in a family where parents were trying to work virtually and perhaps 2 or 3 students were also trying to work virtually. That made it very difficult to share the internet as well as to share a limited amount of equipment. So we understood very, very clearly and very quickly that there were some technological inequities, and that made it difficult for everybody. So I want to move along to planning. When you do high quality, ongoing professional learning, educators feel supported and prepared to create those equitable learning environments that foster students' social and emotional competencies. Ongoing professional learning is the key word here. It's not a one-time, one-and-done deal. But once you present on how to build an equitable learning environment, how to foster students' social and emotional competencies, then you should have some supports in place in order to help teachers do that. That support might be a coach. It might be working with each other. It might be setting a goal for yourself. It might be reading a book, having a book study. There are all sorts of ways to have ongoing professional learning that keeps you feeling that you are supported and prepared to do the work that you must do. When professional learning focuses on relationship building and cultural responsiveness, school staff are equipped to meet the needs of all students, including those students who may be exhibiting signs of grief, stress, and trauma. And one of the first things we want to do those first 3 to 6 weeks of school, we want to try to uncover the stress our students are dealing with, or our staff. We want to be aware of the signs of grief, because it is not unusual for staff members or students to have lost family members during this time. We also want to try to uncover the trauma that students are going through, and that might be related to the economic situation in their house. And so once we uncover some of that trauma that students are facing, the stress that they're under, we can build our professional learning on how we support them through relationship building and being culturally responsive to the needs of those families. A question to consider as you think about this: how can we develop our cultural responsive SEL practices to respond to the full range of challenges and strengths revealed during the pandemic, the social unrest, and including the adult implicit biases? It's a question for all of us to think about in this time. Unpacking adult implicit biases, looking at our mindsets, might be as simple as those students can't learn because they don't have the family support they need. That student can't learn because he came from a school district where learning is, where their scores are very, very low, and we question how much that student could learn. We have lots of biases about how students learn. We have to unpack those biases in order to help them learn. We have to unpack our mindsets about how we view children, how we view our families, in order to help them become the learner, to develop the potential we know that is inside that person. That's what we're called to do. We're called to be sensitive, to be culturally responsive, to be aware of the strengths that each student brings into our classroom. It's kind of scary when you think about that, isn't it? But that's what we're called to do. So as you plan for SEL professional learning across your district, these are some things to consider. Is your professional learning dependent on what is safe and appropriate to do? Is it dependent upon the available time and the staff needs? When do you schedule your professional learning? Is it after school when people are tired? Do you have time off during the day to do professional learning as a group together? Is your professional learning a book review where you have a book club and you talk about the book you've read and you apply what you've learned? Does your professional level focus on the intersection of SEL, trauma-informed practices, and healing-centered, culturally responsive practices? So those are questions and considerations when you return to your district for professional learning. So this is a chart that you can take back that will help you plan. Your classroom teachers, do they need a definition of SEL and competencies? If they're new to your building and they have not been through SEL training, they do. So you have to identify what they need. Do they need more on adult SEL and skills assessment? Do all of your teachers understand how SEL can be a lever for equity? What do your administrators need? What about front office staff? You want your front office staff to have good relationship skills. They are often the first person that someone interacts with when they come into the office. You want them to be welcoming. You want them to listen carefully. You want them to try to meet that individual's needs and provide for them what they are asking. And what about your families? Do your families understand social and emotional learning? Do they know the competencies? Do they understand why we are helping students and adults develop their own competencies and skills so they can navigate the challenges in life, so they can be successful in life, so they can thrive after they leave us? So this will be able to help you plan. It is a planning document that you can take back and use. So how do we model SEL? So one thing that I want to share with you that might be new in your life is the 3 signature practices. These practices serve as rituals that help to create a safe and positive learning environment. It helps to foster strong, nourishing relationships between adults and students and from student to student. They're useful in staff meetings, in network level meetings, in professional learning, and in classrooms, in after-school program, and during non-instructional time. Wherever you hope to see SEL in your district, I hope you will see the 3 signature practices. And what do they look like? First, they're welcoming inclusion activities. They establish safe, predictable activities that allow students and adults to connect with one another to create a sense of belonging. Activities, the welcoming activities, are connected to the objectives of the day. In our welcoming activity today, I wanted to connect you and to connect all of you together to think about how you care for yourselves. That was the purpose of that activity. You might have a welcoming activity that asks students to talk about a background knowledge of a given topic. Might ask them to talk about what they like about reading. What did they learn from the lesson yesterday that they took with them? That would be creating a welcoming activity that connects to a learning objective of the day. But is it important to make people feel that they belong? And that's one of the reasons for having a welcoming activity. Then we encourage engaging practices, brain breaks, academic integration. You know, what you're experiencing in this webinar is a talking head. About the only interaction we've had is when I have asked you to stop and put something in the chat box or to think about something that you can take back with you. But that is not the best possible professional learning. The best possible professional learning is in a face-to-face situation where you can collaborate around a problem of practice, when you can talk about how to apply your social emotional learning in a specific situation, when you help students understand that this activity you're discussing has meaning for you in life and that they can identify where that meaning occurs. So you want to make sure that in all of your instructional practices, in all of your professional learning practices, that your activities engage the participants. And then we look at optimistic closure. And optimistic closure is a time to reflect on what you have learned and to think about how you will use it moving forward. We have at Castle a book on the 3 signature practices that you can click on this and you can get this book, and it gives you so many examples of how to organize your day using the 3 signature practice. As you move forward, we hope that you will learn from the 3 signature practices playbook, that you will see the variety of ways to establish a welcoming activity, that you will also find more engaging activities to use in your instructional practices, and that you will learn how to close your segments during the day with an optimistic closure. We have often talked about in schools a way to leave the classroom where you hand the teacher a little sticky note that says, "Today I learned." That is like an optimistic closure. You're just not handing the teacher to the sticky note. You might, however, take that sticky note and place it somewhere on a bulletin board. "Today I learned. Tomorrow I want to learn. Tonight I'm going to share with mom and dad and my family one thing that was important to me today. I'm going to share with my family about how I felt about school today." So when you think about those optimistic closures, it is actually talking about how you grow in what you have learned. What are you going to do with what you have learned? And it can occur if you teach reading in the morning, your welcoming activity will be related to reading, and your optimistic closure will be related. And then you'll have a brain break. You might get up and have a mindfulness exercise. You might get up and do stretching exercises. You want to give kids some time to unwind and relax between your instructional periods. And then you may go into math or another instructional activity, again, beginning with a welcoming activity, engaging opportunities with the content, and closing with an optimistic closure. So those are some suggestions for how you might use this. Let's think about next steps. Before we go to next steps, one of the things I would like to do is to ask you, if you have used any of these 3 signature practices, could you drop in the chat book one of them that you might have used? If you have a question about the signature practice, could you put that question in the chat box?
Looks like we're seeing 3-2-1 activity. 3 things I learned, 2 questions I have, 1 thing I plan to try.
Okay, good. I do want to stop and have a moment for question and answers, but did anyone put anything else in the chat box?
Yep, so this one just came in at the end of my staff meetings. I always ask someone to offer up something they are hopeful for.
Oh, that's wonderful. What a great idea. Three, two, one is an activity many of us do, and it's a very effective activity. All right, let's look at some possible next steps. This is homework, but it's really asking you to think about a plan for your district to prioritize adult SEL and build in adult SEL supports. If you really think professional learning is critical to this work, and it is, think about using that grid that I introduced earlier to think about who needs to participate and what SEL-related content they need. If you have future work together, and I know there's going to be another session in September, it would be a good idea to think about how you're going to embed the 3 signature practices in your work. It would also be helpful to think about the professional learning that your school needs around SEL. It's important to use that tool on analyzing your own skills and competencies and sharing that with others in your staff, on your staff, so that they too are better equipped to understand their strengths and their competencies, and also to set a goal in order to improve a particular competencies. So those are the things we're going to ask you to think about as you return to your district. And now, before we have an optimistic closure, I would like to know what questions that you might have. If you want to put them in the chat box, I'll try to answer them.
Looks like here's a question. When do you administer the staff survey? At the start of the year?
Yes, that's a good time to administer the staff survey. However, I would think about doing it in the spring too, because then you have a way of measuring growth.
I'm also seeing another question. What advice do you have to get administrator buy-in into adult SEL?
Well, that is an important question. I think that there are a couple of things that you can do. We have some slides on why SEL is important. One of the things we know from our meta-analysis, which was a study that was done in about 2015 and then also replicated later. We know from that study, and it has been sustained over time, that if you teach students the social and emotional skills, they have less behavior problems. And if I were an administrator, I'd want to know that that's an outcome. They build stronger SEL skills. They have a better view and perception of school. The one thing that surprised us in that research was not only do they get better with their relationships with others, that they develop social skills, that there are less behavioral problems. We expected that because that's what the SEL skills do. They help you manage yourself. They help you understand who you are. They help you build relationships with others. None of that surprised us. But what did surprise us was when students had these competencies and skills on standardized testing, mainly in reading and math, there was an 11 percentile gain. Now, an administrator ought to feel good about that because we live in a world of testing and assessment, and quite often these test scores are compared. Why would you not, as an administrator, want to do something that would help your test scores go up and also help kids manage challenges to become more motivated? I also think another way to look at this is a New York University did research for us on what are some of savings around teaching social and emotional learning? Because we've got to put money into evidence-based programs. We have to put money into professional learning, and what they learned was for every dollar you spend on SEL, you have an $11 return. That's a pretty big deal. I don't know where that happens anywhere else. But that means you save money in other parts of your system. You save money in your community because your students have the skills to be a contributing member to that community. So that's another reason for doing this. There are also benefits around retaining teachers. If you have a good teacher, you don't want to lose a teacher to burnout. You want to keep that teacher. And often you lose that teacher because they do not have the skills to manage the classroom. They don't have the skills they need to build relationships with others. So that's another reason why administrators should pay attention to social and emotional learning.
Great. Got a couple of other questions here. So one is, do you do a follow-up survey?
Meaning a follow-up survey to?
Maybe, I'm guessing it's so if you administer a staff survey at the start of the year, do you do a follow-up survey later in the year?
Yes, you do. I would do it again in the spring.
Okay.
I wouldn't wait a year, because if you learn from a staff survey that there are particular issues, you have a goal to address those issues in your SEL team. You can have a short-term goal, you can have a long-term goal, but you need to know if you're making a difference. And the way you know that is to survey again. One way to know that. I don't think surveys are always the best way to gather knowledge. I think focus groups are a good way. Survey, though, are pretty easy. And when I would all encourage you, when you do a survey to find out what staff's needs are, short and to the point.
Great. And then one last question here. And this question is for you, saying, is the speed of your voice intentional as well? Your cadence is very calming.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm glad it's calming. I grew up in the South. I have lived in Chicago for 50 years. Well, actually 50 plus years. I will never get rid of my Southern accent. It's part of who I am. I don't try to get rid of it. I do try to speak clearly. And I do try to present in a calm manner. I can get pretty excited about this. I'm passionate about this work. I've been doing this work since 1993, when I was a building administrator and we implemented a social and emotional learning program. I'm pretty passionate about it. And there are times when I can get excited. But when you're not there to see my face, I think I try to keep my voice at a level that is more calming and reassuring. So does that take care of all of our questions?
Yep, that covers all the questions that I can see.
Thank you. And we're close to the time. We're almost through. Let's go to the optimistic closure. Earlier in the program, in this session, we talked about when you lead for SEL and equity, you prioritize relationships and you center whole personal wellness. What does that mean to you? And I'm going to tell you one of the things that this means for me is when you prioritize relationships and you center whole person wellness for your students, for your staff, you are going to have practices and supports in place that meet the needs of all of your staff and all of your students. And that's equity. Everybody has the same opportunity to learn. Everybody is offered a curriculum that is vigorous. We know that some students struggle with learning, but you want them to have the opportunity to do the very best learning that they can. So when you prioritize those relationships, you're talking about equity. You're giving everybody the opportunity to advance in their learning, to advance in acquiring those competencies they need to deal with the challenges in their life. You are also centering them as a whole person. So that's what it means to me. It may mean something different for you, but for optimistic closure, I'm asking that you take this question with you and think about what it means for SEL and equity to work together for the benefit of all learners. And it may mean something different to you, which is okay. I just wanted you to close with what I thought or what I see it meaning for me. That's where I get passionate about this work. I wanted every student who entered the school where I was a building administrator to be able to grow, not only in their social skills, but in their academic skills. That was my expectation for every student. And it's still my expectation wherever I'm working. This is what we're called to do. So thank you for your time today. It's been wonderful being with you. I want to tell you on September 1, Pat Connor will be working with you, and she is going to be talking about some activities that you can use in your classroom for promoting social and emotional learning with students. Thank you, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Ruth. There are some comments down there that are thanking you for a wonderful presentation. We do want to make sure we thank you for your time and your dedication in supporting all of our educators here today. As you stated several times, this information has always been extremely beneficial, but it's particularly critical right now. We need to establish that shared agreement to promote an inclusive school culture like you talked about, which I think was amazingly insightful. Provide that staff learn time to collaborate and model those competencies, and also build that space for adults to be able to connect, to be able to listen, and to be able to heal together with their colleagues. That's so important. Also that encouraging the examination of our own biases and building culturally proficient practices, how that ties into SEL so well was just wonderful to have reiterated to us. These are all just so many insightful ways to assist adults in our buildings to then further assist our kids socially, emotional, behavior, and academically. Specifically, those last three signature practices that you went over with us were really, really great to be able to provide even more to our kids. So finally, your thoughtful homework assignment for us all to build SEL practices in our NeMTSS framework will hopefully assist in moving districts in our schools in Nebraska a lot further. So again, thank you for sharing your wealth of knowledge. your experience and your insight into fostering adult relationships to build a positive and inclusive climate centered around equitable opportunities.
Thank you, Casey. And I really want to encourage everyone to scan this code, give me feedback, or to enter the link you see at the bottom, because that's information that I take very seriously and it helps me improve as a presenter.